So if you look on the first page of your notes of this picture, see these cute little foxes. These are fennec foxes. What stands out when you look at them? Yeah, obviously their ears, right? Yeah. And so the reason I put this picture in there is one of the things you can think about when you see any animal or plant is, well, why does it look like that? Why do these fennec foxes, how do they have those big ears? Like, how did they come about? Why do these specific type of foxes have these huge ears?
Evolutionary.
And yeah, Kate, you're right. That's the answer in general. They have these ears because they've evolved big ears over a period of time. Natural selection, which we're going to be learning about today, has sort of shaped the species of fennec fox to have big ears. So when you look at those big ears, you might think, well, why? Why do they have such big ears? Like, these are probably pretty good meals for predators, a little fennec fox. So like those ears, maybe wouldn't they like stand out or make it easier to see them or something like that? What are so what, kid?
Like a hair surrounding, so not sneaks up on it.
So you feel like maybe those large ears help them to hear better? What if I told you there's actually another reason for those large ears? It's not related to predators.
So they can closely approach rabbits?
No. Can you guess about anything else? What's that? These fennec foxes live in sort of around the Mediterranean, like North Africa, in kind of lots of times very dry, warm deserts and things like that. That's the ecosystem they live in. Could those big ears be useful for anything else? I have another reason that's related to living in the desert. What do animals that live in the desert have to deal with? Heat. Anyone want to take a guess as to what?
Natural hat.
You're on the right. You're close. You're getting close, Isaiah. It's not that they don't like fan themselves off, but
Hats. Like shade.
Sort of. They're long. They're big. They have blood vessels in them. Kaya? Yeah, it helps keep them cool because what happens is they can use those big, thin ears to like get rid of body heat, like release heat as if their body temperature is getting too warm, they can release heat through their ears. So that big surface area helps them get rid of as much heat as possible. So really, those ears are an adaptation. That's what we call traits that things have that are helpful. That's an adaptation they have to living in the desert. Over time, they've evolved that because it was an advantage to have big ears to help get rid of excess heat. And that's what we find when we're studying evolution, natural selection. We find that traits that are helpful, beneficial, become more common in the species. Any trait that's harmful, what do you think? What if these ears actually made them more vulnerable to predators? Do you think they would have big ears? Because any fox is born with big ears, what's going to happen to them? They're going to get eaten. And then they're not going to pass on their genes for big ears to the next generation. So natural selection, this process, favors helpful characteristics. And it eliminates harmful characteristics. That's kind of the key point for us to understand about evolution and how species evolve. So this is our unit, evolution. What's the definition of when I say species evolve, what am I actually saying? What do I mean by that word evolve? Yeah, that's a very good explanation. It's a change, right? If I say a species has evolved, I mean it's changed over time. Like in the Pokemon Go game, you ever play that?
I have it.
Okay. You evolve the Pokemon, right? And they
Candy though.
what?
You evolve with candy though.
Well, I'm just saying that they change, right? They change from one version into another version. Evolution is to change. It's changing a species over time. It could be things like their ears getting larger or smaller, or the animal getting bigger or smaller, its fur color changing, the way its body works internally changing. But species, we know, do change over time. And we can see many examples of evolution in nature. And we'll talk about some of the evidence we have. But there's an important thing that you need to know, because it's a very common mistake that students make. If I go back here, can this fennec fox, this specific one in the picture, can it evolve? Can its ears suddenly shrink or grow? No, it's stuck like this. This fennec fox was born, it has these traits, and it's either going to live or die. An individual can't evolve. An individual doesn't change. It's born one way, basically stays that way. So sometimes people make the mistake saying, this fennec fox will evolve to have bigger ears. No, it's just going to have whatever size it was born with. The way evolution works is that the population, the entire group over time changes because certain traits become more common. But one specific individual doesn't evolve over time. So that's really important. Populations evolve, not individuals. So evolution is what we call a scientific theory. In science, in science, a theory is something that's been proven over and over again. Many experiments have confirmed that species evolve. It's been tested many times. That's what theory means in science. Now, in like the way he's talking everyday English, sometimes a theory means like a guess. I have a theory about, who the murderer is on the CSI show. In science, a theory is something that's well confirmed. It means something kind of different in science than it does in how we use that word every day. So evolution is a theory. It's well established, and we're going to talk a little bit about the history of that idea here. So I asked you all earlier about Darwin. And last week we watched a video that kind of showed the life of Darwin a little bit. And Darwin was studying to be a minister, a religious person. Wasn't really sure what he wanted to do. He always loved sort of nature and going outside, collecting fossils and animals and plants. But he didn't know what to do for like a job. He was maybe going to be a doctor, maybe going to be a minister. But then he got this offer. He got this offer to go on a trip around the world, which at that time was a huge deal, right? People, didn't sail around the world very commonly. It took years to do. And he was going to be the ship's what they call naturalist. Basically all along the stops, and you can see this is the journey that Darwin made on the ship called the Beagle. They went from England down to South America, bounced around the coast of South America, up the other side to the Galapagos Islands, which are over here, then continued on to Australia, okay, all the way down around the Horn of Africa, back to South America again, and then back up to England. This huge journey. Along the way, at each stop, Darwin was studying things, collecting fossils, collecting animals, taking notes, looking at the rocks, the geology. And as he did this, he started to ask questions about, well, imagine if you took this trip, how many different types of animals and plants you would see. You're going to South America, the east or west coast. You're going to Australia. You're going to Africa. You're going to see a huge variety of plants and animals, ecosystems. And so this led him to start thinking, well, why is there such a huge variety of living things? Why are there huge differences in the organisms we see in different places? Why are they each adapted to certain ecosystems? Okay? And that's what started him thinking about his ideas of evolution and natural selection. Because around this time, what did most people think, including all scientists? What was the idea about the species that were on Earth? Yep, God made all animals exactly perfect, and they never would change. Like that, the idea was that God would create the species, and God would never create anything imperfect. So they were created this way, and they've always been that way, and they always will be that way. Darwin's ideas were, well, actually, when we look at these organisms, when we look at the fossils, maybe they have changed over time. And that went against what a lot of people believed at the time. They believed species would never change. They would stay the same forever. And Darwin's ideas were sort of questioning that idea. And that's why he took so long. You remember from the story, the video we watched, he came back to England and he had his notes and he had his ideas and his theories, but he only told a few of his close scientific friends about his ideas. He didn't write a book and publish it and have everybody read it. He was worried. He knew the ideas he was proposing were different than what most people at that time believed. Who was the other guy? The younger guy that also found the same thing. Wallace. Wallace was the younger scientist. He also traveled very extensively. He also saw a big variety of living things. And he came up with basically the exact same idea as Darwin, separately. He did it later, and he eventually went to Darwin, and Darwin's like, oh man, this guy found the same thing I did. I should have published this 25 years ago. But eventually, Darwin and Wallace both get credit in some ways, but Darwin gets more of the credit because he was first. This is Darwin when he was an old man. So what Charles Darwin did, the reason he's a very famous scientist, is he proposed the idea, the theory, called natural selection. Because there were other people that said species change over time, all the way back to ancient Greece and China. There were people throughout history that said species change. Darwin came up with a way to explain how they change. We call it the mechanism of natural selection. There's a lot going on at this time in science. You know, in the late 17 and 1800s, there was a lot of people studying many different things that all sort of came together to help us understand evolution. There were geologists studying the rocks that made up the Earth. And they started to say, well, the Earth is actually really, really old, maybe billions of years old, which was against what many people thought at the time, which it was a few thousand years old. People were studying populations and population growth. Okay? Around this time, Gregor Mendel was studying genetics with pea plant experiments. And so all of these scientific ideas are sort of coming together around this time. So what is some of the evidence? That's what we're going to be talking about here in the next couple of slides. How do we know that species have changed over time? One of the most clear types of evidence and the most visual is fossils. Okay? Fossils, which people have been finding, fossil is the remains of a plant or animal from long in the past that's been preserved in rock. And when scientists study fossils, what they found was that actually most of the things that they found in the fossil record are no longer around. They're extinct. And so that led people to question the idea that all species are the same and never change. Well, here's a whole bunch of things we have in the fossil record. They don't even exist anymore. Scientists learned how to tell how old the rocks are, right? Radioactive dating. And we know the Earth's about 4.5 billion years old. Here you see dinosaur footprints. You see a trilobite. You see Archaeopteryx. This was a very famous fossil. It's called a transitional fossil because scientists found these transitional that show the in-between steps from what we have today to what we had long ago. And Archaeopteryx was a transitional fossil that showed us that birds evolved from where? Any ideas?
Yes.
What? Where did birds come from?
Dinosaurs.
Yes, they evolved from dinosaurs. And Archaeopteryx is a fossil that scientists found that kind of has in-between traits. It has like a bony tail like a lizard that birds don't have. It has claws at the ends of its wings like a reptile would. Birds don't have that. It had feathers, however. It had teeth in its skull, which is like reptiles, but not like birds. So it had some features of birds, some as reptiles, and it showed how reptiles may have a group of reptiles evolved into birds. Okay?
Might it be hard to find like instead of like bones for those because they birds have hollow bones?
Yeah, but you could still, they do have hollow bones, but they still can be preserved in fossils, yeah. Here's horses, and I told you a little bit about horses before, I think. Horses were once tiny little dog-like creatures 60 million years ago. Today they're huge creatures with hooves. They used to have toes. Their teeth were different. And we can find, scientists have found along the way, fossils of these other species that show us how the horses gradually changed over time. So fossil evidence is very clear that species changed. We also can look at sort of the structures, the parts in or on living things that can help us understand evolution. If you imagine a human arm, a whale's flipper, and a bat's wing, well, they seem all very different. Like an arm versus a flipper that swims through the water versus a bat, which has a wing that flies with. But when we look a little closer at them, when we look at the bones inside of them, this is what we see. Do they look similar? Yeah, they really have the same bones. Now, some of the times they're bigger, shorter, thicker, thinner. But again, we have our upper arm bone. Okay, our humerus here. Well, whales have that in their flipper. They have a little humerus in their flipper. Bats have a humerus as their upper wing. Then we have two bones, the ulna and radius, that make up our forearm. There it is in the whale. Okay, it's here. They've been fused together in the bat. We have a bunch of wrist bones. We have long finger bones. They're all in all three of those species, which helps to tell us, well, why would a whale flipper have the same kind of bones as a human arm? What does that actually mean? What'd you say? Why would a whale flipper have the same basic bones as a human arm?
At one point they were on land.
At one point, what?
They were on land.
Yeah, that maybe whales evolved from a species that once lived on land. It had limbs like a land animal. And that's exactly what happened. Whales evolved from sort of a wolf-like animal. Now, over time, their limbs have changed from those limbs to flippers, but they're there.
Yes, they transformed to fish.
That helps us understand the evolution of these species. And this makes sense because all of those, a bat, a whale, and a human are all what? They're all mammals, right? And all mammals evolved from a common ancestor at some point in the past. We can also see, if we look inside of the structures of animals, there's like some leftover pieces, like snakes. And if you look carefully at their bones, they have little tiny leg bones. They're inside, but they're kind of leftovers. We call those vestigial structures. And they're leftovers. What does that tell us about snakes, maybe? They have these tiny little leg bones inside their body.
At one point they walked.
Yeah, at one point in their past, they were evolved from reptiles that had four limbs.
At one point didn't we have tails? That way we have tail bones.
Yeah, if you go back in our evolutionary history, yes, you could find a common ancestor. Now, we didn't have tails, but our ancestor, millions and millions of years ago, did. So that tells us about evolution. We could look at the embryos of different species, and what we see is like an embryo of a human on the right in the early stages looks exactly like the embryo of a lizard or a pig or a tortoise. Now, as the embryos develop, they start to become more different from each other, obviously, but they go through many of the same stages. Early on in human development, there's actually gill slits in an embryo. Obviously, humans don't have gills, but through their development, they still have kind of the characteristics of some of their earliest ancestors. Sorry. And then finally, we could also now, because we have technology that allows us to look at the genetic code of different species, what we see, if we compare the DNA of different species, it's in organisms that are closely related in evolution, the molecules are much more similar. For example, if you take this protein called cytochrome C and look at it, it's exactly the same between humans and chimpanzees, this protein. If you compare a human to a mouse, it's about 91% the same. If you compare it to corn, it's 66% the same. And so by comparing these molecules, we can kind of build sort of the family tree of living organisms to see how closely things are related. So that's all evidence that we have for evolution. Okay? So DNA shows us that we share, over 97% of our DNA with chimps, that it's that similar. Because if you trace back our evolutionary history, we have a common ancestor not too long ago, a few million years ago. Sometimes people don't make the mistake saying, well, humans evolved from monkeys. That's not what it we say is that we had a common ancestor at some point in the past. That means two different things, right? Like you, if you imagine you and your aunt, you weren't born from your aunt, but if you go back in your family, you have a common ancestor in your grandparents. So how does all of this happen? How do species change over time? That's what we're going to talk about. That happens through a process we call natural selection. So we know that in nature, more organisms are born than can survive. They all can't possibly survive. There's competition. Sometimes they have to compete for food so they can get enough food to survive, or water, or living space, or mates. But there's always competition in living things. And so some competitors are going to be successful and some aren't. We also know that there's variation. Right? We're all humans. We're all the same species, Homo sapiens. But obviously there are variations between all of us. That's true also not just of humans, it's true of squirrels, or oak trees, or worms. Even though like we see squirrels, we probably say, oh, they're all the same. They all are identical. They're not. They have variation. We just don't really notice it. So when you have competition for some resource and variation, some of the individuals are going to survive better than others because they can't all survive. The ones that do are the ones that were born with the most beneficial characteristics, whatever those characteristics may be. We say that they're more fit to survive. And if they can survive, it means they can then reproduce eventually and pass on their traits to the next generation. And that repeats over and over again. So traits that are helpful become more and more and more common over time. What if you're an individual born with a trait that's not helpful, that's harmful? Are you going to be able to survive if you're competing with others? No. So you're not going to pass on that trait. If you're born with harmful traits that are negative, you're not going to survive to pass them on to the other next generation. And so what determines which individuals survive and which don't? We call that the selecting agent. Sometimes it's predators are the selecting agent. And they're preying on individuals. Sometimes it might be the presence of food or a living space. And if we repeat this process for many, many generations, it can lead to the entire species taking on certain traits, certain beneficial traits. We sometimes call this survival of the fittest. That's kind of a shorthand phrase. And what does it mean, survival of the fittest? Notice it's not survival of the strongest or the fastest. It depends on the situation. Sometimes it's helpful to be big or strong. Other times it's helpful to be small and hidden. Sometimes it's better to be fast. It just depends on the situation. It depends on the conditions. Whichever individuals have the helpful traits, they are going to survive better and they're going to pass on their genes to the next generation better. That's what natural selection is. So natural selection always has sort of these components that are kind of listed here in this image. First, we have overproduction. More organisms are born than are going to survive. They can't all make it. And they're all different from each other. That's called variation. So, which ones are going to make it? The individuals that are best suited to the environment, best adapted, we say. They survive, like these darker colored deer, and then they can reproduce, passing on their traits to the next generation. So what you'll notice in this image, we've gone from a population of mixed fur color over time to mostly dark fur color, because for some reason, that darker fur color gave an advantage. And those individuals survived better than the light colored fur individuals. So let's look at a couple more examples, then we'll move on to our activity. Giraffes. Giraffes have long necks. Obviously, you know that. So that's the variation. That giraffes didn't always have long necks. At one point in their evolutionary past, they had shorter necks. So how did they evolve now when you see giraffes, they have these huge long necks? Well, there was some natural variation. Some giraffe, like if you measure my neck length and your neck length, there's going to be variation, right? We're not all the same. We don't all have a 5-inch neck length. Some people have a longer neck, some smaller. Same was true in giraffes. There is some variation. But giraffes eat food up high in the trees. And so the giraffes that happen to be born with a slightly longer neck can get a little bit more food. And if they can get more food, that means they can survive better when there are times of low food. And they can reproduce more. And when they reproduce, they'll pass on the genes for having a little bit longer neck to their offspring. And then that repeats for generation after generation after generation. The necks of the giraffe as a species, as a group, get longer and longer. Now, one individual giraffe can't just like stretch its neck longer and evolve. It just has a neck of certain length. So why didn't that continue? Why don't giraffes have necks that are 50 feet long? If they could reach taller in the trees, why wouldn't it just continue longer and longer?
Disadvantages to that.
Exactly, Kate. At some point, having a neck that's too long is a disadvantage. Maybe your heart can't get blood all the way up to your brain. And what happens to those giraffes? They die. And so you don't pass on those genes to the next generation. So through this process of evolution, giraffes have reached sort of the ideal neck length. Another example, peppered moths. We'll do an activity, I think, when we're going to look at these. So these peppered moths that you see here, they actually have a lot of variation in their color. Some are light colored, some can be dark colored, some can be in between. The story with these peppered moths is that they lived in the UK around the time of the Industrial Revolution. And before the Industrial Revolution, the trees were mostly looked like this. They were light in color, the trees. And so the more common moth was this light colored moth because it blended in better. Sometimes darker moths were born through natural variation or mutations. But what happened to them usually?
They all died.
Why did they die? From what? Yeah, by predators finding them really easily. But what happened is, as the Industrial Revolution went on, and humans started using coal and things like that, pollution turned the trees darker. Well, when the trees became darker, which moth had an advantage now? And what happened to the darker ones? They could survive better because predators didn't find them. And when they survived, what else could they do next? Reproduce. And when they had little moth babies, what were they like?
Same.
Probably darker. And so over time, what we saw in England is the moss gradually became darker. The species was evolving to be darker. Now, could this individual moth become dark? No, it's born, it's light. Oh, sorry, you're born light. You're probably going to get eaten. So the individual moth couldn't evolve. The species as a whole did. Okay, last example. Probably many of you have had like strep throat or an ear infection. And what is the treatment they give you if you have strep throat, if you go to the doctor? Anybody know? What kind of medicine do they give you? They give you an antibiotic. You know, did you ever take like that pink amoxicillin, that gross tasting bubblegum one? And if you ever have had an antibiotic, do you stop taking it once you feel better? They tell you, what do they tell you to do, Kaya? Do you know? Yeah, you got to take all of the prescription, even if you feel 100% better.
Because it can come back.
Exactly, Isaiah.
Because it might not fully be.
Yes, and that could be dangerous, what Isaiah was just talking about. So let's imagine this now from a perspective of evolution. Let's say I have strep throat. What that means is in the back of my throat, somehow I got some strep bacteria that are growing. They're irritating the tissue of my throat. They're making it red and swollen. My throat hurts really bad. The bacteria is growing in there. So I go to the doctor. I get my antibiotic. Start taking it for day 1, day 2. Starting to feel a little better. Day 3, I feel a lot better. Which bacteria in my throat have died from the medicine? Which ones, kid? The weaker ones, right? Some are more vulnerable to that antibiotic. And so they die off first. And then we get to this population where we've killed off most of them and my throat feels better. But there might be a few that, I don't know, for some reason they were born, they could withstand the antibiotic better. And so if I stop taking it, what are those resistant ones going to do? They're going to keep reproducing. And they're going to pass on their strong resistant genes to the next generation. And so a couple days later, my throat's probably going to start hurting again. But this time, all those bacteria came from the strongest ones. So it's going to be harder to control that infection. So that's why they tell you to take your entire prescription when you have an antibiotic like that, because you want to be sure to kill all of them and not to leave some of the strong ones to come back and cause your throat to start hurting again.
Yes. The sandals keep being kept above the water.
Yes.
I've seen this one.
Oh, you've seen this before, Cade?
Yes.
Yeah. So, bad idea. Not smart.
Except with
But is natural selection going to work in this case?
I mean, well, that's a modern plant.
Maybe.
If it gets wet, it'll shorten itself.
Maybe. But maybe these guys, some in the pool, aren't going to make it in the next generation. Pass their genes on. Maybe they wouldn't have a chance in either way. Okay. We'll save this video for it. All right, I know that's a lot of notes, but now we understand a little bit about evolution, natural selection. We can start to do some activities to help us better understand.